all had productive mornings, especially those of you who've been involved in this symposium over the last day and a bit. It's been very, very intense this morning. There's a few of you who've come across from the session we were running before our very short lunch break. So it's really good to see you all here. We're going to crack on pretty promptly. This is so prompt, it's not even 1 o'clock yet, but hey, we've got a lot to get through and only a short time allocation to do so. So Jill, Timms and myself will be chairing this particular panel. We have 5 splendid panelists, and thank you to them for joining. Today's been a bit of a nightmare with Zoom, so well done everybody for managing to navigate that. The title of our session is Logos and Logistics, the Challenges and Opportunities of Certifying Food Production to Promote Sustainable Consumption. So we have different perspectives being offered upon this from our different panelists, who include we've got Anna Barker, the Head of Commercial Partnerships at the Fairtrade Foundation. We've got Professor Alex Hughes from the Department of Geography at the University of Newcastle. Alex has done a great deal of research over the last couple of decades into ethical consumption, and will undoubtedly be sharing many fascinating insights, even though we're limiting it to 1 or 2. Richard Griffiths, providing an industry perspective, Chief Executive of the British Poultry Council, so great to have that particular perspective. Professor Valerie Nelson from the NRI at the University of Greenwich. Again, Valerie's got decades and decades of experience crammed in doing impact evaluations, in particular of ethical trade and sustainability and so forth. So again, very interesting perspectives there from across the world. And then we get the perspective of a retailer, but not just any old retailer, a retailer from the global south. Woolworths in South Africa, Kobus Pienaar will be discussing his perspectives with everybody. So basically the format of this will be that we'll take each person in turn, and they will have the opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes. And during that time, what we'd like them to do is, first of all, to rapidly introduce themselves, and then to give us one opportunity and one challenge that they perceive going forward within the sort of general ethical sustainability space. Okay, so if I hand over now to Anna, and please take it away, Anna.
Great, thanks, David. So I'm Anna, as David's mentioned, Head of Commercial Partnerships at the Fairtrade Foundation. So I work with and manage the team that essentially holds the relationships with our business partners that source Fairtrade goods. And so for those of you who don't know, Fairtrade is a certification body. You'll probably see us on bananas and coffee and cocoa, but we actually work with a quite wide variety of products and commodities and supply chains from all over the world. We've been in the UK for over 25 years now, and we work with a lot of different sort of supermarkets and brands, so from Ben & Jerry's and Co-op to Maltesers and Tesco. So lots of different companies that we work with to promote fair trade sourcing. I think reflecting on the questions that David shared in advance and what we're seeing with regards to sort of certifying food consumption and what we're seeing at fair trade is, I suppose, the challenge and opportunity is really quite interlinked, in that the opportunity is consumers really, really care right now. They're really interested. They're talking about it. Climate change is at the forefront of their mind. We're definitely noticing at Fairtrade that there's a sort of new understanding of how climate change is interlinked to other supply chain interventions. So if you don't have enough money from sort of trade of your goods because the price is too low, then you're not able to reinvest in sustainable agriculture, and therefore you're not able to sort of mitigate the risks and adapt to climate change. And we are really seeing that sort of shift of mindset, and businesses understanding that too, and consumers really calling on them to do better and really address the issues relating to sort of global trade and the impact that it's having on the world and the people. At the same time, we're also seeing the challenge linked to that is that prices are not going up, and consumers aren't yet calling on supermarkets to do more and saying we'll pay more at the same time. So we're finding that it's really difficult, that the expectations are going up and up and up. Certainly for us at Fairtrade as a certification body, the expectations on us are also going up on what we can deliver and what we can assure and what we should be sort of working with farmers and workers to achieve. But we're not seeing that translate into higher prices in the supermarkets. And there's a still very, very strong narrative that prices are too high, they need to be cheaper, food needs to be an accessible price for everybody. And so it's a very awkward dynamic, essentially, where more needs to happen, but investments need to happen for that to have an impact. But at the same time, it's not translating into more value in the value chain, more money going back to farmers and workers, and therefore it's a bit of a difficult dynamic. So that's probably the challenge we'd reflect on as well.
Okay, thanks, Anna. That's very succinct and yet incredibly in detail, the amount of stuff in there that we can maybe unpack, or we will unpack later on during the discussion. So just to summarize, Anna, from the perspective of Fairtrade, is seeing opportunity in the form of consumer interest around these issues. But the ever-present challenge is that of money. Who's actually going to pay for this, and and people's desire to actually to pay up more to cover the sustainability, the ethical issues, and that remains a constant barrier. Okay, thanks, Anna. That was really, really interesting and a great start to this this panel. So we'll now move over to Alex Hughes. Alex, welcome. Yeah, just hand the floor over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave and Jill and all at Coventry University. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, well, online with you, not necessarily in my kitchen again, as I think many of us are. So I'm just going to say a few words that come from a project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council that I'm involved in, looking at sustainable food consumption in Brazil, China and South Africa. So to think about perspectives and challenges from, to use the shorthand, I know it's problematic, of the global south. So that project is looking at the rising middle classes in those countries and what that means in terms of increased spending power in those countries and implications for sustainable consumption. And so we've asked questions around potential levers for change in Brazil, China and South Africa regarding fostering more sustainable food consumption. And we're interested in situating our understandings of consumption in the geographical and historical contexts of those countries. So sort of very briefly, from a large project that's taken place since 2018, some of the key findings regarding ways in which sustainable food consumption is understood, that there's a focus on the economic, on food security issues and sustainability, with sort of economic concerns at the centre. There are major concerns around health, so a lot of the sort of sustainability issues are tied for consumers and organisations and companies to health, and then concern with sort of food quality and also traditional and indigenous foods. And when we talk about sort of foods that are labelled in various ways as sustainable, whether that's organic or anything else, there are challenges regarding consumer trust and the fact that in many of those economies, labelled goods have a very niche position. The high end of the market are often very expensive, as against a lot of consumer preferences for fresh produce, concerns about quality. And so we're hearing from consumers in our studies about issues of distrust in labels, as well as concern about cost. So there are opportunities, I suppose, to frame it in the way that you're getting at for the panel. I suppose the opportunities are to think about growing the sustainable food consumption movement globally, and in light of increased spending power in many economies of the global south. The challenges come around geographical and historical context and concerns in terms of building consumer trust in labels. So in China in particular, against the backdrop of a whole set of food safety challenges and scares, it's really difficult to build consumer trust. So I think those are the kind of key things I would draw out. And just to finish, I want to acknowledge not only the funder, but the partnership that we have at Newcastle with York Sheffield and Durham universities in the UK, with Sun Yat-sen University in China, Federal University of Rio in Brazil, and University of Cape Town in South Africa. So yeah, we'll acknowledge all my many partners in that. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Super succinct, and it's great to situate these discussions within the context of the global south as well. And as you say, there's some really interesting issues there, and also just things to think about in terms of comparisons with the global north as well in terms of these things. But you highlight there in terms of challenges, issues of trust, because there's a whole load of historical reasons why people in different countries may lack trust in logos and labels, particularly in terms of who's got the power to do the labeling or put the logo on or whatever, and what their motives might be. And then obviously, though, we do have opportunities in terms of increasing interest in sustainability for consumers as the growing middle classes increase in these economies. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. Okay, now let's go to the British Poultry Council for another perspective. Richard, nice to see you. Take the floor, sir.
Thank you, David, and thank you all, and thank you for having me. Really pleased to be part of this discussion. I represent we're the trade association for the poultry industry in this country, and poultry is half the meat eaten in this country. So we've got an interest right from right across the spectrum, from core product right through to specialist producers, and as such, it represents some challenges and opportunities in the food supply chain. But where I started when I was thinking about this question was, what do I think one of the biggest problems is when we're looking at trying to encourage sustainable consumption? And from a supply chain perspective, I think one of the biggest problems is that sustainable consumption needs to be a volume game, and we are very much in danger of treating it as a value game. I think Anna has touched on this subject, but the cost of sustainability at the moment is prohibitive to a vast swathe of consumers, and as such, that really makes, and the same can be said of any unique selling point within food products, it becomes more exclusive, it becomes more desirable, it becomes more only available to those who can afford it. It becomes something of a status symbol. And I think one of the biggest problem we've got is trying to avoid it becoming that something that only the few can afford. And we need to make it a volume game, as we see with chicken, and the majority of poultry sold is chicken, that it needs to remain accessible and affordable to the greatest number of people. Within that problem, I think I'm going to pull out one challenge and one opportunity. I think the biggest challenge, and I've already almost touched upon it, is that trickle-down effects do not work in this food system. It's a great commercial, competitive food system. It works in that environment, but what it doesn't do is allow for the trickle-down benefits of certain products and certain attributes of products, so inputs, to actually those good techniques, that good practice, that fair trade, if you like, to trickle down into the volume that's needed to establish full sustainable consumption. I think that will be a real challenge to overcome, because it goes against the nature of the marketplace. On the other hand, the opportunity that we've got here is that we have standards. And I'm saying that very broadly, that's a very, very sweeping statement, but we have control of our standards. And we have the opportunity to make improvements in those standards on an incremental basis, because that, I think, is what is needed to embrace a broader volume of consumers and a broader volume of products, is that incremental change that everyone can access. And that is where we're looking at the moment, looking to government to support us. We're looking into areas such as, say, public procurement. I know the words social eating would have come up in many forums of this symposium. Creative areas like that where we can support, we as industry and we as government and we as society can actually support a broader incremental improvement in standards to incorporate those sustainable practices and make them normal, make them everyday, rather than trying to sell them as a unique selling point. And I know that the marketplace is much more complex than I've just presented it. And for people to get a foothold in the marketplace to be able to sell it, you need. But I think this is the opportunity. It's the ground level opportunity to make the small changes for the greatest number of people. And I'll leave it there, David.
Oh, it's absolutely splendid. So, we've got obviously some coverage of ground from Anna and Alex, but also, just putting that into other context, the context of poultry, and drawing out another load of nuanced perspectives upon this are really interesting. And the fact that this concept you just brought in there of the lack of trickle down from sort of like high standard to what you might call lower standard production, and how you just don't get that travel is in itself a really intriguing thing to think about. And obviously we won't discuss it now, no doubt it'll come up later. You just brought up the importance of standards. Well, I'm sure we can put the Brexit word in there when we get to the discussion in terms of the ability to control those standards and to move the bar upwards in terms of sustainability of production. Thank you, Richard. That was really, really insightful. Okay, let's now move over to Valerie. Great to see you, Valerie, after your trials and tribulations of getting online earlier. Zoom was trying to exclude you in the cruelest manner, but it's good to see you. So I'll leave the floor to you now, Valerie. Challenges and opportunities.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Lovely, great presentations, really interesting. Glad to be here. I'm a professor at the Natural Resources Institute, social scientist, and NRI is sort of interdisciplinary institute working on agriculture and food. So we've got lots of food systems research, nutrition research, all kinds of things. So please have a look at our website. And I do particular work on sustainable trade and responsible business. And so, as David said, I've done quite a lot of studies on the impact of certification, sustainability standards, certification and labelling, because not all standards are attached to third-party certification and labels. And so because this was about certification, I thought it was interesting just to look back a bit on what some of the evidence is around the effectiveness. There's also an issue about the broader implications of the role of standards going forwards and what's needed beyond standards. So I think there's questions about when I'm asked, like, from your work on standards, do they work? Do they deliver even by their own terms and what they're trying to achieve? It's an enormous answer because there's so, as Alex was saying, so much variation in production locations, in the nature of the value chain governance and power relations. It depends when you look at it because markets don't stay the same. So the actual realization of the achievements, like what standards, different kinds of standards also vary between them. So it's very difficult to sort of generalize about the effectiveness of standards, and they do really vary. So Fairtrade is very different, has different approaches to, say, the Better Cotton Initiative, which is more of a business to business standard, and he's trying to reach the mainstream but has sort of less stringent standards. So I think it's quite important to reflect on that and to say, but I think also, as some of the other speakers have said, there are all kinds of sort of limitations for standards. So yes, they helpfully set expectations and they have levered in resources into sustainable production and trade, but they in terms of being able to tackle really systemic issues in the global economy, standards themselves have aren't going to be able to achieve that, and they're not going to be able to necessarily reverse poverty and weak infrastructure and governance challenges in specific places. So in a way that does follow on from what Anna was saying about the expectations on standards and what you're asked to deliver. So from that, I think there's a realization that there needs to be more collaborative approaches, and a lot of the focus now is on approaches which are called collaborative governance. So they involve multi-stakeholders in sectors. So you might get all the actors together in Ghanaian and cocoa and try to build roadmaps and targets, etc. So individual companies might be setting their own targets, but it's about bringing them together to achieve broader change. There's also landscape approaches, so in specific geographies where you bring, again, actors together to resolve competition over land and resources to try and deliver on multiple goals. There's also developments in what we might say the consumption countries, if we're talking about, as I look at a lot of international trade into the UK, say, or into Europe, with new sort of, there's new international frameworks on human rights and business and human rights and the expectations for business, but that's also translating into legislation in different places. So the French passed a new duty of law of vigilance, which requires companies not just to report on what they're doing, but actually to do due diligence, which is to look for risks to business, to society and environment from business actions, and to mitigate those risks. So there's an awful lot happening. I still personally have concerns, and I think that picks up a bit on what Richard was saying, that there are tremendous commercial pressures in global value chains. So if you talk to a retailer buying apparel in India, there's arguments over, cents in the dollar over, the making the transactions. And so there's enormous pressures going down. That's into UK suppliers, that's into international suppliers, and often lead companies aren't sharing in those costs. So even things where it's mandatory legal requirements coming in, and it may come in now for the whole of the EU, not necessarily now, not the UK, but for the EU, that isn't necessarily either going to reach all companies, or, there's all kinds of, it's not a silver bullet either. So I think that the world, we need to think, although I know this is talking about food in particular, actually it's about all kinds of trade, it's about the global economy, and it's about really root causes. So things like the rules for the game for investment, pensions, it's everything. So, yes, that's like, where do you start? But so Alex mentioned social movements. There's big opportunity in collective action and social movements, but it's also about changing policies and regulations so that the rules of the game can enable fairer trade and sustainable production and really fair trade, not in terms of ethics and human rights. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Valerie. Again, lots of ground covered in there, and yet some very key points coming through that will frame our discussions. And certainly, I think bringing up the systemic challenges is something that just cannot be ignored, and I think too often is ignored in these debates. There is only so much you can achieve through local actions or standard certifications if the rules of the game overall sort of work against that, and you're just relying on niche markets and so forth. So that's really, really interesting. But like you say, there are opportunities through collaborative governance. Brilliant. Okay, now let's move to South Africa, where I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what Kobus has got to say around these issues. We're never normally in any doubt about what Kobus thinks, so come on, Kobus, wake us from our early afternoon slumbers here and make some fascinating points for us about your challenges at Woolies.
Afternoon, David, and thank you to you and your team for the invite. Really pleased to be here. Yeah, I'm speaking from our perspective in Woolworths. We're one of the smaller retailers in South Africa. In 2007, our then CEO, Simon Sussman, challenged us exactly on this, is that consumers are not taking up our sustainability products and what might be the problem. So we had a whole team where we strategized around it, and we realized that people are not going to pay more for sustainability. It's not going to happen, not in South Africa. So what can we do to make sure that we do have products on the shelves that is sustainable and it's got integrity? So we started with a program where we look at from the source right down to consumer. And we call it the Good Business Journey. We just renamed it last year to the World of Wellbeing. And we saw that the potential in South Africa to only source local is number one on our priority list. And we started with our fresh produce and horticulture products. And where we were about 54% importing, we are now 92% local production. And in local production, we've shortened the supply chain, and that helped a lot. So we've got a whole team of technologists working directly with the growers in the field, on the farms. They spread all over the country. So how our approach is looking is that, so to have our sustainable logos on our products, is that we go down to the nitty-gritty of agronomy on the ground. And in agriculture, we found that a mere assessment or an audit from a global gap perspective, or some of the other audits that you get, do tick up boxes from an academic perspective. But what is actually happening on the farm between the farm owner, the advisor, the input suppliers, and the farm managers sometimes get distorted. So we started working in an approach that we looked at when we recommend an intervention to be more sustainable. We look at what will be the return on investment for the farmer, for the factory or the processor, for us as the retailer, and for the consumer. So the savings we made in the beginning, because the impact on farms is the biggest, are in South Africa. If I can reduce the impact on the environment by 0.5%, I'll do much more benefit to the planet than reducing our impact in our in-house activities by 50%. So when we looked at that, what is the return on investment for that intervention? So we quickly moved away from the typical audit style, and we went into an advisory mode to make sure that we do the right thing. And enormous savings we've picked up. And in that process, farmers got a better yield and a better quality. So we needed less land and less water, which is critical in South Africa, to produce what we need in Woolworths. So I feel that some of the speakers said that the challenge is the consumer is not going to pay for it. They're not going to pay for it. We as a team, and I regard you guys as on the panel as a team, we need to look at really where we can save and where we go wrong in the production of food and the processing and the transporting of food. And there's quite a lot of work we can do, and there's still a lot of fat that we can utilize. Our biggest challenge, and this is a challenge that I put on the table, is that how do you convince a customer to believe in the integrity of a sustainability logo? There is a mountain of them. This morning, David, I just tried to count it in the United States, Europe, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and down in South Africa. I stopped counting at 125. So yeah, we're overwhelming the consumer, and we need to be careful not to use it to bargain or to try to increase your market share. So we need to convince the consumer, and we need to be more transparent in what we do at source right through to the shelf. And that's my story.
Thanks, Kobus. That's a really interesting perspective on these issues, thinking about the sustainability very much from the economic aspects of production, and getting things into store, that if you can reduce those costs through being sustainable, through sustainable practices. So it's very much about the business case issue that interestingly people have often talked about it in the literature and in consultancy and so forth, and yet it's never really been nailed down. And of course, one of the arguments against sustainability, and we still see it in all the climate change debates, is we can't afford it, as though we can afford the alternative. So it's wonderful to hear of a significant corporation who's actually tackling that the other way around and looking for the evidence to show where actual economic savings can be made by doing the right thing, as it were. So that's really interesting. Okie doke. So folks, all kinds of issues must be flying through people's heads. So if you've got any specific questions, please pop them in the chat and we will ask them. And that includes the panelists of each other. While we're waiting for all your brains to whir, I'm just going to sort of like put Anna on the spot. Sorry about this, Anna. But following on from what Kobus has just been talking about in terms of, you know, sustainability, ethics, having a sort of like a cost-saving dimension in terms of making businesses more robust. Do you think there's evidence from the 2 or 3 decades of the fair trade journey where actually you can see evidence of that, of businesses becoming better businesses and improving their bottom line as a result of being part of the fair trade program beyond just reaching a market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of really depends on the business. And I think this is the challenge, is that sustainability is not just a cookie cutter and you can just replicate what someone else did and expect it to work for you too. I think businesses who have built relationships within their supply chain, where they have got to know their producers and they've stuck by them, have definitely seen the benefits of that, because after years and years and years of paying a fair trade premium back to that producer group, of having fair trade on the ground come out and train that producer group, over time you have invested in a much more resilient supplier. You are much more likely to get produce for them. And we saw this really during COVID when it hit and supply chains were disrupted. The producer groups had to kind of make overnight decisions on who they continued to supply to. And the long-term loyal buyers were the ones they prioritized, which makes a lot of sense. So I think from that side, we do see business cases for it. We do also see that, you know, the longer a farm's being fair trade certified for, the higher the standards are that they're having to meet, the more profit hopefully that they're making to invest in that. And therefore you're not having to suddenly pay way more for a cocoa bean from a farm that's much more sustainable. You've been on that journey with that farm and you've supported them along the way to meet that. So I think we do really see it, but we also engage with businesses who kind of want to work with fair trade on a bit of a piecemeal basis. They kind of come in and out of the system. They sort of wait and see what the market's doing. And in that case, they're not necessarily going to realize the business benefits because they're not necessarily committing. So it's working with fair trade, and it's also that kind of long-term piece. But absolutely, we definitely see some businesses who realize the bottom line benefit from it, and they really stick with us. And that's why we have some really sort of core partners who've stayed with us for such a long time. Is for them, it's a bit of a no-brainer now. They've been out there, they've met their suppliers, and they've really seen the difference it makes for their business.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, Anna. Anybody like to comment on that further, or take an observation from their own expertise and experience? Richard, I just wondered whether on that point you could comment in any way in terms of the poultry industry. You know, do you have evidence of where taking a more sustainable journey is actually helping segments of the industry in terms of just becoming better businesses?
I think there are. I completely recognise what Anna's saying, and that's sort of that important side of how you do business, how businesses do business, and how they operate in their practices in the marketplace. For us, up to now, I think we've been focusing more on how we produce. So those changes that can be made within the process of producing poultry, that in the past might have been labelled as efficiency or productivity gains. But the importance of making efficient and productive processes, make them the sustainable way to do things. So it's familiar, anybody who knows health and safety, sort of the easy way, make the easy way the right way. So up to now, we've been focusing on making those internal processes as good as they can be, as efficient and as resource efficient and as they can be, and that has generated better businesses. Certainly, I think we're running up against, as a sector, I think we're running up against what every other sector is running up against in the marketplace. In that, that's a much more dynamic and not necessarily within your control thing to influence, and I think it will take investment. A lot of investment, and not just by businesses, not just by food producers, but by an actual sea changing sort of government attitude of we will invest in order to achieve this desired outcome. And it's not necessarily, well, it is for a return. From our point of view, sustainability is a fantastic return, but it's not from a point of view of a financial return.
Okay, that's interesting, if slightly depressing, but we'll see how that plays out over time. I'd like to, I mean, obviously, Alex, you've had the opportunity to look at these kind of issues across countries and continents. I just wondered if you had any comment on the role that governments can they do or don't do in terms of supporting, ethics and sustainability within supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, that's a major question, isn't it? And I think to say the least, and I think that there are perhaps more significant arguments, or that the argument for a greater role for government is being heard more now than I think it was sort of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but against the backdrop of I mean, this is an understatement, a very volatile geopolitical context. And I think it's also understanding that as well in terms of trade deals that are going on, around food safety and standards. And yeah, I think you mentioned sort of Brexit earlier. So yeah, I mean, I think big differences if you take a sort of international comparative approach. So yeah, from the project I was talking about, I mean, the issues in China in terms of sort of strong government, but distrust in government, and also, yeah, certainly issues around on the food safety side and priorities there, but challenges regarding traceability. So I think that has been brought up by other panelists, and government roles in sort of regulation around traceability. So yeah, you can observe that sort of differences between sort of national economies in terms of the role of regulation, and then we can scale that up to the regional level to look at the role of sort of the EU, for example, and sort of regulation at that level. And then, yeah, where you've got the sort of trade across borders, where the regulation is and what it applies to. So I've crossed paths before with Richard on the subject of AMR, antimicrobial resistance, including in the poultry sector. And that's sort of really interesting in terms of traceability challenges regarding antibiotic usage, for example, where there's kind of quite strong national action plans, say in the UK, regarding the use of antibiotics and targets. But when you take the supply chains across borders, those targets and traceability and data is really difficult to come by, and needs much tighter regulation in order to work. But how that regulation and governance would actually be operationalized is mind-blowing at that scale. So yeah, I guess just to simplify, I suppose it's looking at the role of regulation, state regulation at a number of scales, at the national scale, at the regional scale, and then the sort of the transnational international context when we're looking at supply chains stretching across national borders. So yeah, it's a huge question, Dave, that I certainly can't answer in the context of a tight panel, but suffice to say, I think it's a big one. And certainly in the time I've been looking at supply chains, consumption and sustainability, that question about regulation is a much a louder one. It's more amplified now than it has been in the past, and rightly so.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And obviously, all those years ago, we were looking at wild harvesting of flower supply chains, and we, in South Africa, and the regulation on paper was magnificent. The enforcement was virtually zero. So we've certainly seen, not only do you have the challenge of having regulation, it's then about enforcement and communication and a whole array of other issues. So it's really interesting. Now we have got some comments and questions popping up in the chat now. We've got a question really here about the confusions that consumers face with logos and standards and so forth. And I think, as Kobus said, if you start counting how many different logos and certifications there are, in any geographical terrain, it becomes quite, well, it just drives you mad, frankly. And as researchers, we go, oh, what's the latest one on off the block or whatever? What's the latest sort of, multilateral discussions and agreement coming out of this institution or whatever that are supposed to drive and coordinate these things? So we've got a question here about, is some kind of, meta standard a possibility? Anybody like to go? Valerie, would you like to comment on whether or not, well, number one, do you think logos are actually of much use? We'll start with that. And then do you think that beneath that, is there a need for, or even a possibility of actually having some kind of standards that are much more international and widely understood?
Yeah, God, that's another big question, isn't it? But I think it's debatable, and that individual consumer buying will get us out of the problems that we're in. That's what I'm trying to say. The power dynamics in global value chains and the scope for national governments to regulate these processes is becoming more limited. So I think, yes, logos are useful. Actually, interesting, I saw in the press here, Lidl supermarket is going to have an environmental traffic light system for products. So that's quite interesting, because I think, obviously there does need to be a way of saying, because, although some consumers are more interested, a lot are not interested, and a lot of the press, we have a lot of growing inequality. So as other speakers said, for consumers, this is very difficult. So I don't think this can be solved through individual consumption decision making. It has to be through broader collective movements, into political realms, and it's about issues, the sort of regulation of the global economy. And I sat in a researcher talking about the role of Amazon in consumption, being the marketplace in the US now. 4 out of 5 consumers going straight to Amazon and making their purchasing decision through Amazon, and it has control over what the traders on the platform are doing. So they're like a private version of a market. So we have to really see the bigger picture, because I think there are lots of companies doing interesting things. There are business benefits that can be tied to making improvements in the value chain, like Kobus was saying, and particularly some of the more leading companies are trying to do that. But if you look at the bigger picture, which is always my interest, but what is the whole of the companies doing in a sector, and what Alex was talking about, let's look at what is happening in China. If you introduce standards, sometimes it actually just has displaced the deforestation impacts to the next place. So I'm sorry that it sounds so, the problem is it always can sound just so negative. It's like, this is an enormous problem, but actually we're not going to solve it unless we look at the real systemic nature of these challenges, because however hard Woolworths tries, is going to face these challenges of the supply pressures of the buyers, and of the global economy. So that's my view.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Valerie, for that response. I'd just like to take the next question over to Kobus, because we've got a question from Catherine's asking about the costs of certification processes. So what kind of response do you get from your suppliers? You've done very, very well at Woolworths to get a much more local supply base, Kobus, for which Woolworths, I think, that's to be congratulated on that. For many reasons, but obviously there's always a cost to being involved in these things. So maybe you could just give us some quick insights into how your producers feel when asked to be part of programs like Farming for the Future, and also if you've got any just general wider views on the whole cost of certification.
Yeah, David, it is definitely a problem that our farmers is facing. I've got one of my grape farmers up in the Northern Cape who's exporting mainly to Europe. His season is 16 weeks, and in the 16 weeks you get 18 audits. So it's not only the cost of the actual assessment or audit, it is the time they need to spend and all the administration they need to do. And then on this similar point, for instance, how to wash your hands, a simple thing. I walk into a pack house and I saw all these hooks in different places. So he says, if this retailer walks in, the hand wash must be here. When this one walks in, it must be here. So he's got all these hooks. It depends who's visiting him. He just hook it where it is. So it's definitely an issue. We need to, as the industry, we need to make up our mind what we actually want out of this. And some of the assessments is getting a 3/4 of the cost is just for a rubber stamp in Europe, what we face in South Africa. And that is quite a concern. And so you get resistance from farmers. So it's definitely, if we can solve it for them, I don't have a plan for that. We fund our sustainability program out of the savings we do in the chain. So that's what we do. But the mere just putting down money for assessment, and then the time they need to spend on it, and then the minor differences between all the so-called standards is quite a challenge for our farmers to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. Anna, is this something that you hear through Fairtrade about the cost of Fairtrade and then other certifications that may well be required by the same growers?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a big issue. I think audit fatigue is very, very real for any grower supplying into global supply chains where the expectations are just going up for them from different bodies. I think the thing that's really hard is that in an ideal world, standards would align and they would be cohesive, and it would reduce the ask on the producer groups, it would reduce the cost for the retailers, ultimately then it becomes more accessible for more consumers. I don't think standards have agreed what their core principles are to do that yet. So for fair trade, for example, obviously we have a minimum price, we have a premium, we're the only standard that has that. We're not really going to budge on it. That's kind of the principles of fair trade, is that we guarantee some of that value will go back to a producer group, and we will then also have teams on the ground that support them to meet standards. So I think it's just really difficult because you have all these standards with different focuses, and I think every standard feels that what makes them unique is their driving sort of mission, and therefore they're not willing to budge on it. So I think if the industry was clear on what they want, and I think Kobus just made that point really clearly, we're all trying to sort of strive for best practice, but it's not absolutely clear what the retailers at the end are asking for, or the customers, for us to all to say, right, if we came together, it could look like this now. And therefore we're all sort of just like sticking to what we believe is the right way to intervene to supply chains to make them fairer for producers. So I think it is a big challenge. I think it's leading to this proliferation of standards. Consumers are getting confused, and it's becoming very expensive. But I just think in general, there's not yet that end point that everyone's agreed that they're going to work towards.
Okay, no, excellent points. And I think it's just really, oh, Valerie, you look like you
just a quick comment just to say that I think also standards aren't the only game in town now. There is all these other different things of ways of intervening in supply chain standards, you know, and that might be about, well, Kobus was saying about investing in, you know, your suppliers. So there's that sort of capacity building approach, but also there's things like benchmarks, which are to exert pressure on a whole different companies, but on the sector, to say independently, you know, to rate corporate practice, because it's also how do you reward companies that do better than others, as well as try to, you know, galvanize the laggards. So they're coming through. So I think it's quite interesting. And then I was talking about the sector approaches and landscape approaches and sustainable finance. So it's a very broad field, but I think what's interesting is the mandatory laws that are coming in as well to try and give a bit more oomph. However, I still think that there's bigger questions about where do you actually need to decouple global value chains and have more localized production. It's quite interesting, Kobus saying about in South Africa, because, you know, I think, as Anna said, you can't have a cookie cutter. So we also have to, you know, we have to achieve enough action on climate that we're all here and functioning as societies. So, you know, as well as tackling human rights effectively. So when you have multiple goals, how really is that best achieved? I think that's probably about uncoupling some of the globalization that's occurred.
Wow. Well, unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time, but I think we could have kept going for ages. The issues here are been really interesting to listen to from the different stakeholder perspectives, and yet there is a lot of consensus, I think, in terms of the views that have been expressed by our panelists and indeed folk who pop comments in the chat. I mean, ultimately, there's no doubt this is a very fertile area for research, a very fertile area to be involved with as a practitioner. And I think it's really important that we keep up the dialogue between research and practitioners and people in lobbying and policy spaces, because ultimately the challenges we're talking about are profound. And as we've seen through the climate change report that came out last month, this isn't something that's, you know, on the distant horizon. It's happening all around us. and what may happen in the next 20 years is fairly scary. And then the social impacts of all the climate change issues, well, they just don't bear thinking about really. And never mind all what is going on through the pandemic in terms of the ability for standards just to get lower in so many areas of economic and social life, just because of survival day to day. And it's become very, very easy for organizations and individuals to lower their standards and behaviors because all sorts is going on at the moment. So it's a real, I was just thinking the other day when I was doing my master's 20 odd years ago, and there was all this, it was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall and all these kind of things. And we were told it was the end of history. Everything was just going to kind of settle down now around the world, and it was going to become geopolitically quiet. And it just, for this whole century, just seems to get more and more manic. So somehow or another, we have to, between us, try and make some sense of it and keep on driving, the way forward in our own different contributions, but coming together and collaborating as much as possible, because I think that sense of solidarity and connection and sharing is absolutely critical. So it's marvelous to see, industry with us today, Kobus and Richard speaking completely openly in a way that I don't think would have happened even 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And researchers sharing ideas, Anna being very open about the Fairtrade challenges. This is what we've all got to do, and we've all got to, those of us who can facilitate need to facilitate, and we've got to get the dialogue and find ways forward to deal with these very wicked problems that are facing us all. But thank you so much, everybody, for your time. At some point in the coming weeks, there will be a report from the whole of the symposium, which will include a report on this panel as well. So please keep in touch, and we look forward to seeing you again in the none too distant future, and have a great weekend when it finally gets here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.